We've got a couple big breaking stories today related to big tech, political bias, censorship, and market manipulation. The first, Justice Department to open broad new antitrust review of big tech companies. Inquiry signals Bill Barr's deep interest in tech sector poses threat to companies such as Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple. The next big story we have, a Google engineer with a PhD has gone on record with Project Veritas explaining how he sees the political bias. He believes that the Google staff are wrong when they say they're not biased. They are. But he paints a rather interesting picture. He shows it's kind of nuanced, and there's a sort of ignorance in how Google acts in a very biased way, in a way that could be very, very damaging. So I want to follow this up with some examples, but I do want to end by showing you this story from just last week. A Google expert to Senator Cruz, 15 million 2020 votes are at risk. This man, Dr. Robert Epstein, who is not a conservative, explains that Google is swaying votes. And this ties together with what Project Veritas has shown us in this interview. There's a sort of ignorant action taking place because these systems are being run by biased individuals who think they're not. So first, let's get started with probably the biggest breaking story. There's going to be an antitrust review of big tech. Now, this is not necessarily an investigation, but it could lead to one. So hold your horses, everybody. We're not quite there yet, but this, in my opinion, will absolutely lead to some action. And the reason I think so is they talk about they're doing the review to determine whether or not these big tech companies are stifling competition. And I can show you that, yes, they are. And I have a lot of examples to show you how they kind of work together to, it's strange, right? Because it's almost ideological and market-based. These companies want to protect their business, but in the end, they kind of act together in ideological ways. That's rather creepy. So antitrust is greatly welcomed, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now, I don't know what the right thing to do is. I don't want to advocate for what they should or shouldn't do, but I do think we need to do something. Now, before we get started, head over to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. There's a PayPal option, a crypto option, a physical address, but you know the drill. YouTube has deranked independent political commentary, and I gotta stress, I am making a video right now explaining that Google is facing antitrust. I can't imagine they will appreciate this. That means if you like this video and think it's important, share it on social media to help spread the message. But first, let's start with the Wall Street Journal and go through what's happening, big breaking story. They say the Justice Department is opening a broad antitrust review into whether dominant technology firms are unlawfully stifling competition, adding a new Washington threat for companies such as Facebook, Google, and Apple. The review is geared towards examining the practices of online platforms that dominate internet search, social media, and retail services, the department said, confirming the review shortly after the Wall Street Journal reported it. Now, I want to make sure we stress social media is in here. That may wrap up Twitter. The new antitrust inquiry under Attorney General William Barr could ratchet up the already considerable regulatory pressures facing the top U.S. tech firms. The review is designed to go above and beyond recent plans for scrutinizing the tech sector that were crafted by the department and the Federal Trade Commission. They say the two agencies, which share antitrust enforcement authority in recent months, worked out which one of them would take the lead on exploring different issues involving the big four tech giants. Those turf agreements caused a stir in the tech industry and rattled investors. Now, the new Justice Department review could amplify the risk because some of those companies could face antitrust claims from both the Justice Department and the FTC. The FTC in February created its own task force to monitor competition in the tech sector, as the team's work is ongoing. The Justice Department will examine issues including how the most dominant tech firms have grown in size and might and expanded their reach into additional businesses. The Justice Department also is interested in how big tech has leveraged the powers that come with having very large networks of users, the department said. So I think that's the gist of it. They do go into greater detail, but I don't think we need to read too much into that. I want to make a few points as it pertains to market bias. But here's the thing. Whether or not these big tech firms are stifling market competition, there is an absolute tie to politics right now and their ideology. So the first thing I want to reference is Patreon and what we saw following the exodus back in December. For those that aren't familiar with the story, Patreon had banned a while ago, maybe a year and a half ago now, Lauren Southern. When they snapped their fingers and wiped out her income, that sent ripples through the community, mostly in the political sphere. We saw people like Sam Harris say, it's not a safe place and I'm going to be leaving. I don't think he left right away. He might have. It's been a while. But essentially, this scared people. Now, my response was, Patreon should not outright just ban people without warning, and they should give people a chance to migrate because we're talking about income. But then, in December, Sargon of Akkad, real name Carl Benjamin, who is a YouTuber, political commentator, was banned from Patreon again, without warning. But this was a, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me moment. Many people said, I will not be fooled again, and fled the platform. Around this time, I also left. But here's what's interesting. Many of these creators then went to Subscribestar, which I currently use now. When everyone did, there was a lot of press. And then we saw something interesting. PayPal, Stripe, and other payment processors removed access. They canceled their partnership with Subscribestar. This was disconcerting because it looked like Silicon Valley was acting to protect its own interest, either to stifle market competition or for ideology. Now, of course, many people will say it's about the ideology. They'll say these companies were biased and were trying to stop conservative voices from being able to fund themselves. Although many of the people who fled weren't even conservative. There were some journalists and some, comedy channels. And there's my channel as well, which is, centrist, but I get it. They don't like me. They don't like Sargon. However, it was presented by a lawyer named Leor Lesser, who's a YouTuber law on YouTube, that there's potentially a monopolistic issue here in that why would PayPal suspend services to a rival company to Patreon? It may be that they're trying to stop another company from competing with service used by PayPal. So Patreon allows PayPal to, send money. And that means PayPal probably gets a percentage of that. By PayPal then suspending services to a rival company, that may have been a trust violation of some sort. So I want to make sure that's clear, that you can see there's an overlap between ideology and potential market violations. So now before we get into an example, I want to show you of both. I do want to go over what Project Veritas has now in this latest interview. Now, I believe they're framing it, I don't believe they're framing it as a whistleblower necessarily. I believe they're just saying that he's taking great risk going on the record and explaining what he sees. Veritas story reads, current senior Google engineer goes public on camera. Tech is dangerous, taking sides. He says, it's time to decide, do we run the technology or does the technology run us? I really don't buy the idea that big tech is politically neutral. Are we going to just let the biggest tech companies decide who wins every election from now on? He says, I look at search and I look at Google News and I see what it's doing. And I see Google executives go to Congress and say it's not manipulated, it's not political. And I'm just so sure that's not true. Adding, I have a PhD, I have 5 years experience at Google, and I just know how algorithms are. They don't write themselves. We write them to do what we want them to do. Here's what's interesting. Google has addressed algorithmic bias. A good example is when you search for inventors, what do you see? Well, right now, people believe that Google is manipulating the search for inventors. But the point is, if someone writes an algorithm saying, when you search for this, when you search for X, you will see Y, the person's bias is in that algorithm. It exists. So Google's trying to intervene, but what they end up doing is rather ideological. And then you can see that basically because Google can't affect every single search, they target their ideological bias and try and manipulate those. It doesn't mean that Google is trying to shut down conservatives, though some definitely are. We've seen the emails. It means what we hear, in my opinion, and definitely check out the Veritas report after this video, what it means to me and what this man, I believe, let me make sure I get his name in here. His last name is Coppola. So do they have his first name? Greg Coppola. He's presenting the actual kind of nuanced stance that I think is true. For the most part, what we have are people in Silicon Valley who are biased, because most people are, creating massive systems which manipulate our behavior, and they don't realize how biased their system really is. An example he gives, when you search for Donald Trump, 20% of those stories come from CNN, an outlet that absolutely hates the president. Well, you can say they don't hate the president, but come on. It's an orange, it's jokingly referred to as the Orange Man Bad Network. So yes, it's almost all negative press from CNN. What that means is, whether Google is trying to be biased or not, they are. Google has recently deranked my channel, and that's why I really do sincerely mean it. Share this video if you think it's important. Not just my channel. They deranked a ton of people across the board, notably David Pakman, who is a progressive. And he did a big video exposing this and showing the data. What they did was they deranked independent commentary. Here's what happens. All of the big corporate channels get propped up, including Fox News. But out of all of the big media channels, how many are centrist or conservative? One. Fox News caters to a more centrist and conservative audience, mostly a conservative audience. Where do centrists go? Where do moderates go? All of these other channels that are being propped up, CNN, MSNBC, etc., and the local news outlets, are left-leaning, which means though their intention is to prop up what they view as authoritative sources, they end up propping up traditionally left-leaning outlets and only a few conservatives. Independent commentary tends to be centrist and right because of this, because moderates and conservatives and some center-left individuals are looking for a nuanced position they don't get from corporate media. But corporate media gets propped up. That is bias. Now, I do have some examples, but I want to stress a very important point. Recently, you may not be aware, I was just in Dallas. And the reason is because Glenn Beck invited me out for an interview. It was actually, I got to say, it was really, really interesting. We did not agree on pro-choice. We did not agree on the Colorado Baker stuff, but we had a very cordial, amicable, and interesting conversation, I think. One of the most important things that came up was how I was describing the danger of algorithmic bias. When you explain to someone that since the early 2010s, we've seen a massive spike in the media reporting on these social justice identitarian stories, that will influence people, but it's hard to truly grasp, especially if you're in that bubble. Imagine you're talking to someone who is a progressive, and let's say they're acting in good faith. You explain to them the media is biased, and they say, I don't see it. Well, the reason they don't see it is because they're in that bubble. Try and ask them about some story about, say, the ICE facility in Tacoma or Andy Ngo, and they probably won't know about it because their bubble doesn't talk about it. They can't tell that they're being shifted ridiculously far to the left. But here's a real example. A couple of years ago, there was a serious algorithmic nightmare scenario occurring on YouTube, of which I reported on and many other people reported on. It was a finger family algorithmic disaster. What was happening was that someone discovered at some point nursery rhymes got hundreds of millions of views because mothers, and to an extent fathers, would hand an iPad to their baby and they would turn on a song called Finger Family. The babies would stare at the screen. The parents thought, I'm occupying my kid's time. It's educational, fun family, songs. The algorithm realized Finger Family does well and started showing it more and more. Now here's where it gets scary. The babies weren't touching the screen. It's just babies in their crib. I was going to say cage. Babies in their crib, just looking at the screen. After that video ended, YouTube would automatically play a similar video that fit the algorithm. This led to a wave of children's content that was mostly okay. However, eventually some people, notably in India, found they could exploit the algorithm. They started making extremely low quality, creepy videos, and you could probably still find some of these. Eventually it got really weird, and you could see certain disreputable historical figures that no one should be watching dancing along to crudely recorded nightmare songs that it sounded horrifying, but the video would be titled Finger Family. You would see Elsa, Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk. You would see disturbing imagery, things that are so offensive I can't say it in this video. And babies were watching this because the algorithm was feeding it to them. This was real. Now, here's the thing about the media. They like to claim that YouTube is a rabbit hole. It really isn't in this regard. The reason this problem happened with the babies is because babies couldn't choose. They couldn't say, I don't want this. They were forced to stare at the screen. Now think about people being inundated by a manipulated far-left media that keeps going crazy trying to find something that will outrage the audience to get them to watch. It's why most news about Trump is bad. They can't tell they're watching the freaky nightmare content. So do this. Google search, Incredible Hulk, Finger Family, algorithm weird. Try and find some of these videos and you will see just how nightmarish they are. Because we're not in that bubble, we can truly see how freaky it is. Now imagine the same kind of system is feeding regular people who read BuzzFeed, who read Verge, who read even now the New York Times, and they're getting this nonsense. Their world is being shaped by it. Is it the intent of the people running Vox.com to drive their audience into a delusional state? Of course not. But they keep chasing after this narrative to try and get the clicks because these companies aren't doing well. They have to feed that addiction. And it gets crazier and crazier until, I kid you not, they say Donald Trump is worse than racist. Worse. What does it even mean? They've run out of space, so they have to keep escalating what he is, Orange Man bad, every single day. And this is the danger of these big tech companies and why we do need to step in. And it's kind of, it's not as specific, but we do see this in what this guy Greg Coppola is saying, that the algorithms are created by people that are feeding everything in this one direction, and it becomes dangerous. But I want to show you some real examples of why we do need something to step in. Now, there have been polls showing most people do think we need some kind of regulation. I know there are conservatives who disagree, but look, I'm not saying shut the companies down. I'm not saying break them up. I'm not saying restrict what they can or can't do. I'm saying something. Something. One of these, we'll figure it out. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what we can do to make the situation better. Check this out. This is a story from 2017, okay? Google explains why it banned the app for Gab, a right-wing Twitter rival. Gab's free speech stance makes it popular with right-wing trolls and racists, Ars Technica says. Now, I'm not super concerned with why Google did it. But I'll explain. They said, in order to be on the Play Store, social networking apps need to demonstrate a sufficient level of moderation, including for content that encourages violence and advocates hate against groups or people. Because Gab is a free speech network, Google removed them. Okay, well, that's not necessarily a violation of antitrust, but there is an argument that there's no real contender for an app store. That if you're out of the Google Play Store, you're off Android for the most part. So that's an argument to be made about market competition. Why should their rules supersede the option of the public to purchase a product? Well, you can argue that Walmart refuses to sell a product, fine, but there's not just Walmart, there's competition. On Android, it's the Play Store. On iPhone, it's the App Store. You get what you get. Now, you can argue against that, but let's check this out. Here's where it gets actually scary. This is a story from just last week. Google bans Gab app, gives the decentralized social network an impossible list of demands. Recently, Gab federated. What this means is they've overhauled their code to become part of an open source social environment. Anyone can create their own server, federate, and then using an app that grants you access to what's called the Fediverse, you can type in a domain and go to it. Long story short, it's essentially a browser for social media. You download the browser app, the Fediverse app, whichever one you want to use, type in the domain you want to go to, and you will see that social network. This allows you to follow people across different social networks. It's quite brilliant. Open source. Here's the thing. There's a multitude of apps that act like a browser and grant you access to these networks. One of them was Gab. The Gab app in this instance contains no content. None. You can go onto it and you can type in whatever server you want, just like any browser will let you do. Google banned it. Google removed, or I should say, from this story at least, they told it they had to remove it. And my understanding is now it has been banned, even though it was #1 trending. They said you had 7 days. But here's the thing. The Gab app didn't have content on it. It's quite literally impossible for them to moderate this content. Why then would the Play Store remove only this app, which I assure you, basically identical to many other Fediverse apps, just a browser? In fact, I believe the open source code was identical to other apps that were not removed. This is removing someone from the market for no real reason. And Google has the power to do that. Here we can see it's something personal. Whatever the reason is, they're saying the app wasn't violated of user-generated content, but the app had no content on it. Interesting then. What we can see here is an absolute bias. It has to be personal or political. It wasn't professional. The app didn't break any rules. They still threaten them anyway. And then we have the last story I want to go over, where I really want to stress the importance of some kind of action. I'm not going to read through this, but I do recommend you follow up and actually watch what this guy has to say. And I gotta say, Ted Cruz has done a really great job addressing this. I also want to give respect to Elizabeth Warren, get a bipartisan thing here. She's presented proposals for dealing with big tech. It needs to be done. Anybody who's on board with this, you have my respect. I don't care for tribe. Okay, Elizabeth Warren is worthy of criticism, so is Ted Cruz. But if they're going to tackle this issue correctly, then you have my respect. Elizabeth Warren has talked about breaking up big tech. Well, we're looking at antitrust right now. Much respect for her for bringing up the issue. I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but it needs to be addressed based on this story alone. I can show you all the other examples, but this story alone. And Dr. Robert Epstein, an expert, testified that 15 million votes can be swung due to the bias of Google. And he believes at minimum 2.4 million votes were swung because of Google in 2016. Whether or not you think there's a mischievous man up top at Google laughing and trying to take over the world is besides the point. I don't think that's true. You can, if you want, fine. I do think there are biased employees that act, to be, politically, to gain advantage for their political side. But in the end, what I think is happening is more like what Greg says. These algorithms are being built by people with a bias. It's a bias then against conservatives because they think conservatives are outside their bubble. They can't see it, and they don't realize how bad it is. When you're outside the bubble, you can watch it happen. But these people they're stuck in their own world, and they don't see it. I have a poll. I'm working on a story, a big one, that shows liberals primarily get their news from liberal sources. That means if liberal sources don't see this because they're all getting news from themselves, they have no idea they are trapped in a bubble. Those of us outside the bubble can see it plain as day. The rules are biased against conservatives, specifically the misgendering policy. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm saying it straight up. If conservatives don't agree with that worldview, you're biased against them. Now think about what happens. Twitter says you can't misgender someone. That's a line in the sand. That means from this point forward, policy and public discourse developed on Twitter will never oppose the idea of misgendering. But there are certainly 60 to 70 million people in this country who think that's wrong and think the misgendering policy is strange. Why should Twitter dictate that? The employees at Twitter are biased, think they're doing the right thing, and thus they're shaping the future of discourse in this country in a negative way. They shouldn't have that right. It should be up to the people to talk to each other and figure out what makes the most sense, not one big tech giant. And I'm talking about Google in this regard. Twitter isn't as big a player as Google is. But then think about how Google employees determine what is or isn't fake news. In fact, the story on censorship, in my understanding, came from Gizmodo, a left-wing outlet, where they said Facebook employees were biased against conservative sources and removed them. It's here. And because these people on the left aren't outside their own bubble, they're in it, they can't see it. Fortunately, this man, Dr. Robert Epstein, is not a conservative, and he said, I believe he was asked if he supported he opposed the president. He says that's an understatement. But the fact is, it's real, and to those of us who are outside the bubble, we can see it. So to finalize this video, the antitrust probe is coming. It's here. It's been announced. And I believe it will likely lead to an investigation, a full-on investigation. We'll see what happens. I mean, they're essentially in an investigation now, but I think what the review is, they're going to look at surface-level stories. They're going to try and see if there's grounds for a full-on investigation. The investigation will probably look into the company's internal practices. We may even see communications to determine if they're acting in anti-competitive ways or if they have a political bias. And that's going to be really important. I want to stress on a final thought as well. The interview from Veritas is very straightforward. This is not a grand expose, in my opinion. We're not seeing someone leak documents that prove the world is ending, but it's substantial and probably, in my opinion, the most important thing Veritas has done on the issue. Now, they've shown us internal documents, James O'Keefe. This is an interview with a current on-the-record employee of 5 years with a PhD saying, here's how the system works and here's why it's biased. This should be the biggest bit of evidence anyone can use. It's not an anecdote, right? Well, you could argue it is, essentially, but here's the thing. It's not one small out-of-context bit of evidence. It's not some woman in a cafe speaking off the cuff. A Google senior engineer with a PhD, been at the company for 5 years, is saying, I'm seeing this happen, I work here, this is my expert opinion. So this counters what we're hearing from the executives, which means something is happening. This is the main, what we see here is unquestionable. Okay, they argue that James O'Keefe edits things out of context and all this other stuff to try and defend against it, but you can't defend against someone going on the record who currently works for Google and has a PhD on the issue. So this is extremely important. Watch the full interview. Obviously, ProjectVeritas.com. I think they did a great job. Great interview. So whether or not things get resolved is besides the point. I don't know. I don't. But we can see that there are certain strange anti-competitive behaviors, ideologically driven behaviors, and most of us have been watching it happen for years. I'll leave it there. Stick around. Next segments will be coming up, youtube.com/TimCastNews starting at 6 p.m., and I will see you all then.